Alright, so if you're a musician looking to change your pickups or preamp and terrified of breaking out a soldering iron because you're not familiar with electronics, then this video is for you. This is a question I get asked almost on a weekly basis, and I often refer people to YouTube to look at soldering tutorials. The problem is most of these tutorials are geared toward the maker community, so they're doing circuit boards or Arduino things. So musicians generally have just one of three scenarios that we're soldering. We're soldering two wires together, we're soldering a wire to a terminal such as a potentiometer or your barrel jack or your output jack, or you're soldering a wire to a potentiometer case to ground it. Those are the three most common soldering scenarios, and they're actually quite easy to do. So let's go to the bench, and I'll take you through the tools that we use to do this, and then step-by-step, very easy to follow instructions on how to soldering for noobs. And trust me, it's not that hard, so I'm hoping you'll come out on the other side of this, ready to grab a soldering iron and give it a go on your own instrument, because you can do this. All right, let's take a look at the tools we need. The first thing you need is a soldering iron. Pretty much any small soldering iron will do, whether it's the type of pencil soldering iron that you just plug straight into an outlet, all the way up to an expensive digitally controlled unit like I have here. Honestly, for years, I just went to Harbor Freight and Tools and I got a $30 little soldering kit, and that served me well for a long time. It doesn't need to be expensive. You just need a good soldering iron with a small tip. The next thing you need is some solder. I recommend the 60-40 blend of solder. This is the most common one that you'll find out there with rosin core, which means the solder has a little core of rosin inside of it to help the solder flow. The diameter of the solder is very important. A lot of first-time solderers make the mistake of going to Home Depot and grabbing a roll of solder, and that's actually solder intended for plumbing use. What we want is actually very small diameter solder. The solder I use on the benchtop here is a 0.6 millimeter. It's very tiny. It's like a 22 gauge wire in diameter. And the reason for the small diameter is that it melts faster. Next, you need something to clean your soldering iron with. This could be a sponge or a brass wool. Both work equally well. And of course, you're going to need some tools. I use a pair of Nipix wire strippers because I'm stripping wires all day long, and it makes this incredibly fast and easy and consistent. A pair of wire cutters and a pair of needle nose pliers. I highly recommend getting a set of helping hands. You often see like these little ones with all these appendages on there. I actually prefer this one that has a wider plate with 4 arms that come off of it that flex in any direction. It's very stable and holds almost anything. I find it perfect for guitar work. And lastly, you're going to need something to cover up your soldering when it's done. Electrical tape works just fine, or you can get some heat shrink tubing, which gives you a nice professional clean look when you're done. And again, you don't need a lot of tools to make this work. The first thing is to set your soldering iron temperature. Generally, anywhere between 600 and 640 works just fine. Before you solder, you'll always want to clean the tip. Once it's up to temperature and you look at it, if it's got black oxidation or looks really dull or crusty, it's not going to transfer heat well. So you will run it through your sponge or run it through your brass wool and clean it off, and you should have a clear silver finish. It may not be shiny, but it should be clear of all that black oxidation. I usually pre-10 wires before I connect them together. So I'll put them in the set of helping hands. I will touch just a little bit of solder to the tip after I've cleaned it, put the soldering iron on the wire, and then touch the solder to it, and you'll see that the solder will flow through the wire. The reason for tinning the wires, it makes it easy to solder those wires together after they've been tinned because they already have the solder on them. Let's start with the wire-to-wire soldering scenario. You'll strip your wires, tin the tips as we talked about. At this point, cut a small piece of heat shrink tubing just big enough to fit over the insulation, and I'll slide that over the insulation before I solder anything. You'll place those two tinned surfaces close together using the helping hands. You'll clean your soldering iron, wet it just a little bit with the solder, put the soldering iron underneath the connection, and then touch the solder to it, and you'll see the solder will just flow over the whole connection. Pull it away, and you'll see the solder solidify. It'll turn from a very shiny to a less shiny finish, and that tells you it's cooled. You do not want to move it until it's cooled. After that, you just slide your heat shrink tubing over that connection, and then you can use a heat gun to heat it up. Then the heat shrink tubing will shrink around the wires. If you don't have a heat gun, you can also use just a regular butane lighter and just hold it a couple inches underneath it and wave it back and forth for a few seconds, and you'll see the heat shrink tubing shrink up. The second situation that we're going to talk about is soldering a wire to a terminal. This is most commonly seen when you're soldering a wire to a potentiometer terminal or you're soldering it to a barrel jack or output jack. So one of the challenges of soldering to a terminal over soldering to a wire is that the terminal is going to sink more heat from your soldering iron. So you're going to have to keep the heat on there longer because it's going to get sucked into that metal and drawn away from your joint. So again, I start with a stripped wire that I have tinned, clean the soldering iron, and this time, instead of wetting the soldering iron, with the wire in place, I'll put the solder on top of the connection, and then I'll touch the soldering iron tip to that solder and press through it into the terminal. This wets the tip, makes the connection, and then I can just start feeding the solder into it until I see the solder flow around the terminal. And once it's done that, I'll pull everything away and wait. And again, you'll see that the solder will cool and slightly go from shiny to less shiny, letting you know that that connection is hardened. So why do I keep talking about wetting the tip of the soldering iron first? This is very important for heat transfer. If you just clean your soldering iron tip and then apply it to a wire and try to transfer heat, there's not much surface area contact between that tip and the wire, and it takes longer for that heat to get into the wire. But if the tip is wet, then a lot more of that heat will instantaneously go into the wire and make contact. And the last scenario is soldering a wire to a potentiometer case. This takes the challenge of heat transfer that we had on the wire to terminal scenario and even makes it a little bit more difficult because that entire case is now drawing heat away from the soldering iron tip. So you're going to need to have heat on there longer and more consistently for it to work. To do this well, you need to make sure that the surface you're soldering to is clean. If it's an old potentiometer and it has oxidation or crud on there, you'll want to get some alcohol and wipe that away so you have a clean bare metal surface to start working with. Then we'll take our soldering iron, clean the tip, and then I'll lay the solder on top of the case where I want to connect the wire and then press the tip of the soldering iron down onto the solder into the case. After a couple seconds, you'll see the solder sort of melt into the case and then the heat will spread. Keep applying solder so you get a little dot of solder on the case and then pull it away. This is basically a landing pad where we're going to put our wire. Now we use our helping hands and we place the wire on top of that pad. Once again, clean the tip of the soldering iron, put the solder next to it and press the soldering iron into the solder and wire, and you'll see that the pad that you made, the wire and the solder will all sort of melt together. Apply a little bit more solder and watch the heat spread. You'll see that little pad expand as the heat goes through the case, and then remove both the solder and the soldering iron and let it cool. That's it. That's the three scenarios you're going to see as a musician. Again, it's terrifying to pull into your electronics, but the soldering part really isn't that hard, and you can get started with a very small investment with an inexpensive soldering iron and solder, and grab some scrap wires and start working on wire-to-wire soldering. You'll realize that making these connections on a wire-to-wire basis only takes a couple seconds. Soldering a wire to a potentiometer, maybe 5 seconds of heat, 10 seconds at most. It's pretty quick. After you've practiced and you got comfortable with that, you'll be a pro at changing out your electronics in your guitar or bass. I hope that helps you. Until next time.